So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Kathy, and I'm delighted to introduce you to my son. Kyle he grew up here at Hope and then went to university in London and studied in an NGO context, studied development, and took a job, which is very appropriate to what John was talking about, for agricultural work in Palestine. And then with the war, had to leave Palestine and go into Jordan, and he's going to just share some of his experiences today. And then after worship, he's going to kind of do part 2. So, all right, take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you especially, I wanted to say at the beginning, thanks to Men at Hope and also Pastor Josh and everyone else for kind of giving me your time, giving me the space to be able to talk about this. I'm really happy to be able to kind of, present with you guys and also just discuss at the end. I'm going to have a question period so we can also just kind of talk about what I've been speaking about and any questions that you might have about kind of anything that I cover or anything outside that I cover. And as my mom said at the beginning, I'm going to kind of give a presentation now, and I'll kind of give a quick layout of what it's going to be about, but I'll also be here after the service to kind of talk about some things that I haven't discussed. There'll be a tiny bit of crossover. But yeah, so thank you so much for coming, and I'm really happy to be able to share with you guys. If I could figure out how to go to the next slide. There we go. Perfect. So, yes, my mom already kind of discussed my background a bit, but so I grew up here in Cedar Park and grew up here at Hope as well. I've been coming to the church for a very long time, as long as I can remember. Went to Leander High School here in the area, graduated, and then moved to London, where I went to the School of Oriental and African Studies to study international development, and was there for 3 years. And afterwards, I was able to luckily move into work that I had been studying. Moved to Palestine about 11 months ago, last February, where I was interning with the Union of Agricultural Work Committees, which is a Palestinian local NGO that is a collective of farmers in both the West Bank and Gaza that helps to kind of support small farmers, fisher people, herders in accessing their resources, both land, water, and otherwise, and doing kind of technical supportive projects in the area. So I was very lucky to be able to go out there and be there for approximately 8 months until around after the start of the war. Was in Ramallah at the time in the West Bank, and unfortunately had to leave after about a week and crossed over into Jordan, where I'm now temporarily living and working. Luckily, unfortunately, I could not continue with the organization I was with before, but I was able to get a really great opportunity to work with another NGO called Norwegian People's Aid, which is an international NGO based in Oslo, but working in around 30 different countries around the world, including in Palestine. And I was able to get a job with them, which has been fantastic. And I'm now working still on Palestine, but again, living temporarily in Jordan. There we go. So quickly before going into kind of all of this, just wanted to kind of give a bit of a map to kind of give a bit of an idea about where Palestine is, because this is itself a very highly contentious issue about where is Palestine, what does Palestine look like. And so just to give, I'll have different maps throughout the presentation, which will hopefully help, but here's just a very quick initial one to kind of give you an idea. So you can see hopefully in the red, just below the words West Bank, is the city of Ramallah, which is where I was living for around 8 months. And you can see that there, and then you can also see on the bottom left-hand kind of corner, you see the Gaza Strip there, which has been obviously in the news a lot now and in the past. And it's approximately 50 miles between Ramallah to the Gaza Strip, which is basically from Hope to San Marcos, so quite a close area. And when I was trying to find out the distance itself, I put it in Google Maps, and I kind of included this in the presentation, if you can read it on the top left, because I thought it was quite interesting and indicative. It put trying to calculate from Gaza to Ramallah, and it says, sorry, we could not calculate directions from Gaza to Ramallah, because as I'm going to discuss in a second, that's not really something that's possible. You can't necessarily go that way and cross there, but I'll kind of get into that now. So yeah, I wanted to start off with a quick overview of Palestine's history. I want to state at the very beginning that my intention is not to be able to give a comprehensive history of Palestine. A, not a historian, B, have not been there that long to understand it. It could take years for me to understand it and even longer for me to try and present on it. But I wanted to kind of give a bit of an overview of some of the key pivotal moments of Palestine's history. Yeah, no worries. Ooh. Awesome. Cool. Awesome. And laser. Awesome. Sweet. Very nice. Thank you. That's fun. No way. Cool. Pastor Josh, everyone. Yeah, but just to very quickly give a bit of a historical background. This isn't something I'm going to talk much about in the second presentation, but kind of wanted to quickly touch on it here to give an idea of some of the key pivotal moments because Palestine's history is very complex. So I've tried to kind of summarize it down into some key moments that's helpful to understand for the rest of what I'm going to talk about this morning and also for this afternoon. Ooh, nice. So I'm going to refer back to these four maps later, but just again wanted to kind of show it at the beginning because understanding Palestine, the maps and everything is quite hard and complex and constantly kind of changing thing as I'm going to talk about. And so I wanted to show it at the beginning. So when I talk about Palestine, or when Palestinians talk about Palestine, historically Palestine is this first map here. It's what is now both the West Bank, Gaza, as well as Israeli territories. This is from centuries, which I'll talk about in a second, and then it came to the Ottoman Empire. After the Ottoman Empire fell, it became part of the British colonial mandate. And this was what the map still looked like until 1947, when it gets divided here by the UN, and then later, after several conflicts, becomes what we now know today as the West Bank and Gaza. And then after many, many more wars and political developments, we get today what the map looks like here. And again, I'm going to kind of touch on what these maps kind of mean and their kind of significance in a second as I go through. So, to start, actually, can I hold this? Easier trying to look around. Cool. So, Palestine falls under the Ottoman Empire rule after centuries of back and forth control by various empires, dynasties, in 1516. So, 1516, Palestine becomes controlled under the Ottomans. But kind of the main thing to emphasize here is that before this, there was the Assyrians, the Romans, the Byzantines. Palestine has been constantly back and forth under control of many different empires. Obviously, the Middle East, and especially that area of the Middle East, is very historical. There's been people living there for centuries and centuries and centuries. And so, yeah, just to give a kind of emphasis that it's kind of always been under control by just various peoples. And it has general prosperity and successful regional global trading. Palestine's always been known, I'll cover this in a bit, for its kind of regional trade and its agricultural products, things like this. And it is an important part of the world for this. At that time, I also wanted to include here that there is already nationalist movements happening within the Ottoman Empire, and this includes Palestine. So again, Palestine has been under control by tons of different empires, dynasties, but already at this time, under the Ottomans, there is already a conception of Palestine, Palestinian people wanting their own state, wanting to be able to control their own resources, their own borders, all of this. But these are largely put down, but again, just to emphasize that there is already kind of this national identity being formed in Palestine at that time. And what Palestine looks like at the time in terms of demographics, I've included here on the right a graph, and I'll read it out because it may be a bit hard to see. The 1878 census by the Ottoman Empire that kind of, again, shows the breakdown of the different religions at the time in Palestine. So in 1878, not that. Technical breakdown. Yeah. So we have the Muslim population at the time is 85.5%, the Christian population being 9.2%, Jewish population being 3.2%, and Jewish foreign-born, so recently immigrated Jewish immigrants being at about 2.1%. So it kind of just gives a basic idea about before the introduction of Zionism, which happens in 1897 is when modern Zionism is found, and I'll kind of discuss Zionism in a bit and kind of what that means, and the rise of Jewish immigration alongside it. This is kind of the general overview of how it looks in Palestine. It's a very multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, and then that brings us to, yes, the period of British colonialism. So at the end of World War I, the British take over Palestine from the Ottomans, who obviously lose in World War I, and Palestine, as well as other areas of Ottoman and German control, are divided by the different nations that win in World War I. And present-day, or then Palestine, now present-day Palestine, is divided and given to the British. Before this happens, though, there is the Balfour Declaration, which is a quite important little piece of history, in that it is a letter by the then present-day Foreign Secretary of the British government, Arthur Balfour, to a prominent Zionist in the movement, saying basically that the British government's intention, whenever they have control of Palestine, is to make Palestine a home for Jewish settlement and a Jewish homeland for the Jewish people. So that's just quite important to emphasize, because it shows that at that time it was already kind of a policy of the British that they were looking to implement, and this begins to be implemented in 1922 when the British Mandate is formed in Palestine by the League of Nations at the time. And at that time, there is a quota system on the number of Jewish immigrants that could enter Palestine, which is created after Palestinian Arab pressure to put this, because they are unhappy with the amount of Jewish immigrants who are coming in, buying up traditionally Palestinian land, forcing their way in, and taking over kind of the space, the resources that Palestinians themselves had. But largely these quotas aren't implemented, partly because at that time, historically as we know, the early 1930s, later 1930s, is the lead up to the Holocaust. So there is a huge amount of Jewish immigration around the world, but specifically to Palestine because of the Zionist movement, and it's kind of advertising for Palestine to be, oh no. Yeah, to be a place for a safe haven for the Jewish population. So at that time, yes. There's a high rate of immigration to Palestine, and the demographics that I showed at the beginning start to change. At this time, there's also very high rates of tension and violence between the British colonial power, between recent Jewish immigrants, and between Palestinians themselves. And towards the end of this period, we get to the 1947 UN Partition Plan, which, if I go back a few slides, divides Palestine into 3 separate areas. There we go. So here's the 1947 Partition Plan. We have the blue areas being under Israeli Jewish control. We have the green areas being under Palestinian control, and then we have Jerusalem here in the yellow, which is going to be a internationally administered area. And it was already contentious at this time because it gives 56% of the total land of historical Palestine to Jewish immigrants, even though at the time they were only 33% of the population and only privately owned 7% of here, which you can see in these kind of small blue areas. So already at that time, it's quite imbalanced, but it's seen as a way to give both a separate state, fully sovereign controlled to both Jewish people as well as to Palestinians themselves. But quickly after this, when this partition plan comes out, Israeli militias begin attacking Palestinians, and the state of Israel is declared hours after the British Mandate. The colonial period ends in 1948. At this time, there's going to be a year of fighting between Israeli, now not militias, but militaries and Arab armies over kind of the land, leading to the 1949 Armistice Green Line, which is kind of the current day West Bank and Gaza. And during this time, 750,000 to 1 million Palestinians are displaced, both within Palestine itself as well as outside. Many massacres are carried out by Israeli militias, including the most prominent one is called Deir Yassin, which is just outside Jerusalem, where roughly 100 Palestinian children and women are massacred by these Zionist Israeli forces. And at that time, around 150,000 Palestinians now remain in Israeli territories. And this time is called the Nakba, which in Arabic means catastrophe. And it's a really prominent period for Palestinians even today, because it's a time, obviously, that 750,000 to a million Palestinians are displaced, which now, after these people and their families have left, they've had kids, their kids have had kids, and now many of these people today are still living outside Palestine, and this time is still referred to as Nakba, meaning catastrophe, because it was, right after the partition plan ended, the British Mandate was coming to an end, and people were very hopeful that, okay, now we're finally going to have a time to live in peace, which we now know today has not necessarily worked out, and brings us to another important part, which is the 1967 war. It's a six-day war between Egypt, Syria, Jordan. Another 300,000 Palestinians are expelled during the six-day war. Israeli army strikes preemptively against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and gains control of the West Bank, Gaza here, the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, and Golan Heights up here in Syria. And I wanted to include this slide basically because the most important thing to get out of it is that it begins what is the present day referred to as the occupation of Palestine, because initially the 1949 armistice lines that I mentioned in the last slide allowed the West Bank and Gaza to be controlled by Palestinians, but now, as you see here in this map, it's outlined in blue because Israeli military is now occupying these areas and is in control of these areas. Okay, and then I think this is the final kind of history slide where I wanted to talk about the Oslo Accords, which I think probably many of you will have heard about and might know about. To kind of briefly break them down, it comes about after the First Intifada, which is a largely peaceful resistance movement from 1987 to 1993 in Palestine, where Palestinians kind of have civil disobedience movements, strikes, stuff like this, to show their unhappiness with being under occupation, and the Israeli kind of very violent crackdown on it brings Palestine to international attention and pushes the Israeli government to meeting with the Palestinian movement and leads to the Oslo Accords. So the first Oslo Accords are signed in 1993. Here's a picture of that with Prime Minister Rabin, Bill Clinton, and Yasser Arafat, leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And this is followed in Oslo, or for the Oslo Second Agreement in 1995. And to kind of mention a little bit, at the time, there was a lot of people, especially internationally, who were very excited. The Oslo Accords are going to finally, again, it's going to be another chance for Palestinians to have peace, for Israelis to have peace, for people to be able to control their own lives, and it was a lot of optimism around it. But at the same time, it was very unpopular by both sides of the political spectrum. So the right wing in Israel is very unhappy about this because the thing that leads to the Oslo Accords is that the Israelis have to recognize the right of Palestinians to a state and recognize Palestine as a state, and the same goes for Palestinians recognizing Israel. So for both sides, this is largely unpopular, and the unpopularity, especially as I mentioned here, by the right wing in Israel leads to President Rabin being assassinated by an Israeli extremist a few years later, I think in 1995. And it's also very unpopular, again, in Palestine because they feel that it gives too many concessions to the Israeli state, which I'll mention in a second. Yeah. And kind of the unhappiness by this is summarized by a quote by a famous Palestinian poet, Mahmoud Darwish, who says that it's the equivalent to the Versailles Treaty, which obviously happens after World War I against Germany and leads to the outbreak of World War II because of the kind of heavy, unbalanced concessions or requirements. And the two large results that are supposed to come out of Oslo Accords is that there's an end to the Israeli military occupation that I kind of mentioned in that earlier slide, and that there's an establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state governed by Palestinians themselves. And sadly, both of these things have completely failed to happen. Today, there's still the occupation. Today, Palestine themselves, they don't have control of their borders. They don't have control of their own government. And it also results in these two things that I'll kind of just really quickly touch on, but are kind of helpful to know for if you're reading the news. Oslo Agreement sets out something called the PA, which stands for the Palestinian Authority, to be a kind of transitional governing power in the West Bank and in Gaza. And under this, Palestinians can vote for their own leaders. They have some administrative authority and stuff like this. And today, that kind of system, which was intended to be transitional, is still there today. And it also creates something called Areas A, B, and C. So Areas A, B, and C, I think, is in the next map. Yes, so Areas A, B, and C. So Area A, this is just, we're talking only about the West Bank when we talk about Areas A, B, and C. So Area A is under full Palestinian control. Areas B are shared by the Israelis and the Palestinians, and Area C is under full Israeli control. It's a bit hard to see the map exactly here, but it kind of shows that. I think there's another map in a second that has that, but important to mention that Area C, so under full Israeli military control, takes up 60% of the West Bank. So it's a very significant area in the West Bank, is under full Israeli administrative as well as military control, which for Palestinians who are living there, because there's not a border between this is Area A, this is Area B, this is Area C. There's, when you're there, you can kind of understand, okay, there's a Israeli settlement here, that might be Area C, all this, but it's completely kind of objective lines that have been drawn that divides these areas, and people were already living there when this happened. So those areas, yeah.
So it looks like that's where it's ABC, it's just mixed settlements.
Yeah, sort of. So the best way to explain it, and I think I get to it in the next slide, and I'll kind of point it out, is basically Area A is Palestinian cities themselves, and I think it's 18% of the entire West Bank. So kind of where I was living in Ramallah, that itself is Area A. Area B is kind of in these in-between areas, and then Area C is largely around settlements, which I'll talk about in a second, as well as kind of rural areas in general in the West Bank. But I think I have a slide, no, maybe not in this, yeah, I do, after this, that kind of highlights that a little bit more. But yeah, again, just to kind of go over really quickly. So we have, yeah, kind of Ottoman period, Palestine right here, historical Palestine, good grief. No worries. Some more pictures to look at. Yeah, so we have this here. Here we have the UN designated partition plan. Then we have after the Nakba, after the catastrophe, we have here the 1949 armistice lines that kind of separates today the Gaza Strip here and the West Bank here, both part of Palestine, but also here, which is now controlled by the State of Israel. And then we have today where these lines are still kind of followed, but we have this kind of breakdown in Area A, B, and C because of the occupation that happens after the 1967 war. Yeah, and that brings us to kind of present-day Palestine. So I'm going to talk more about, in the presentation after today's church service, about kind of some of the everyday experiences of Palestinians that I've been able to see, all of this, but I kind of still wanted to have a quick slide that kind of talks about some of the general issues, and then we'll get on kind of to the next topic. So present-day Palestine today is considered by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and many other internationally recognized human rights organizations as an apartheid-like system. So apartheid, as many of us know, that being associated with South Africa, where black South Africans do not have same rights as white South Africans, and this is today what's happening as well in Palestine, as understood by people living there as well as by these kind of international organizations. And aspects of this apartheid-like system include settlements. So settlements are in the West Bank. They're illegal under international law. there are around 280 throughout the West Bank that are recognized by the Israeli government, but again, illegal under international law, not recognized by the US and a lot of other countries, where Israeli, usually far-right extreme settlers, live in these small gatherings, scattered kind of throughout the West Bank, and yeah, kind of disrupts a lot of Palestinian everyday life, which is then again divided into Area A, B, and C. So here's Area A here. So we have, yeah, some of these main cities here, Nablus, Qalqilia, Ramallah, where I was living right here, Jericho, Bethlehem, Hebron, and these are kind of where Area A, which is under Palestinian control, is. But important to mention as well with this is that the entire West Bank, Area A, B, and C aside, is under Israeli occupation, which means that at any point, as does happen quite often, especially right now under the current climate, the Israeli military, for example, can raid a city in Area A at any point. So, for example, I was waking up one morning in my flat. I go outside on my balcony to have breakfast, and I look over, and there's a man being led by blindfold away by 30 Israeli military. And this is an area that's considered Area A, but again, the entire West Bank is under full Israeli military occupation, so really at any point, there can be kind of incursions into these areas. And then Area B here, which is under joint Israeli-Palestinian control, and you can kind of see here, they're kind of still around these similar areas of Area A, and then Area C, which is these blue areas, which is a significant amount of the West Bank itself is under Israeli control. And what is Area C means for kind of everyday Palestinians who live there is that they don't have access to any administrative bodies. So they don't have access to the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, anything like this. They don't have rights to these kind of everyday services. They also means that an important part, especially where I worked in, is that you're not allowed as a Palestinian to build on an area that is designated as Area C unless you have an Israeli permit from the military. However, these, I think about 1% of applications actually get approved, and it takes many years, and means that, let's say I'm a farmer, I want to build a greenhouse. If I don't have that permit, which is basically impossible to obtain, the Israeli military at any time can come completely destroy that structure. It can also go for houses, stuff like this. And so it's a very precarious situation for people living in this area specifically, but just again in the West Bank in particular. There's also the apartheid/security wall that you see here, and I kind of put this dash here to put between both saying the apartheid/security wall because it's quite emblematic of Palestine itself, which is very obviously contentious and can have different viewpoints to both. So, you might call it an apartheid wall, but you also might call it a security wall, and that depends on kind of what side of the argument you're coming from. I say argument, but it's also just, I guess, point of view. And so, yeah, it's important to understand that, in Palestine, again, even with the maps, if you say Palestine to someone, what that looks like on a map might be completely different if you talk to someone else. It might include that entire portion of historical Palestine, but it also might mean just the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and because it has all these kind of implications behind it. And then also we have the blockade on Gaza, which has been happening since 2006, which I don't really speak about too much, especially in this historical aspect, which I kind of just want to mention that that's largely because I didn't live there, and because I think that I can speak best to talking about what happened in the West Bank, what happens today, and what that looks like, and because also understanding what happens in Gaza and what kind of the situation is there is a lot more accessible to find just by looking it up or just by looking at the news and understanding what's happening there. So just to kind of mention why I'm mainly focusing on the West Bank is because of that. And then today as well, there's 7.2 million Palestinian refugees registered and recognized today globally. This includes both people in kind of neighboring countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, but also people within Palestine, within Gaza and the West Bank, which can be quite a confusing idea that, okay, how can you be a refugee, necessarily in your own country? And it's because of this thing that I talked about, the Nakba, which happens in 1948, when 750,000 to 1 million Palestinians are expelled from their homeland. So let's say I'm living on the coast, I'm living in what's now today Tel Aviv, and Israeli militias come, we fear for our lives, we go and we move to, let's say, to Bethlehem. There's refugee camps in almost every single major city in Palestine where people are recognized by the UN as refugees because they were expelled from these lands in 1948 and they still have a desire today to return. And I'll talk about kind of what this looks like today and that kind of sentiment, but I think it's important to mention that, you know, if I talk about with friends today who I'm living in Jordan, I ask them, where are you from? They'll still say Palestine, even if they haven't lived there, their families haven't lived there for over 60 years, because to them, they're still Palestinian, they still have the right to return to their homes that they were expelled from, just as any refugee feels. But just because it happened in 1948 or happened a long time ago, doesn't necessarily mean that they don't still have that right to be able to return to where they're from. So just to kind of highlight that. And in these territories of the West Bank, Gaza, and was now considered the Israeli territories, there's 3 million people, Palestinians living in the West Bank, 2 million in Gaza, and 2 million in Israeli territories. And just to give a bit of an idea of the scale of what Gaza and the West Bank looks like, I mean, they're quite small territories. And here you can see the Gaza Strip right here and how small it is. And if you think about that, in terms of 2 million people living in this area, being fully fenced in, not able to leave, not able to come and go, not be able to leave through their borders. 2 million people living in this area, you know, growing food there, trying to sustain their lives. And now with the constant bombardment of Gaza, you can kind of imagine seeing it against Austin, how difficult that is for people to actually live in this circumstance and to try and do things like evacuate safely to a safe area when you have all these people crammed into this very small space. So yeah, so as I kind of mentioned, I'm also going to give a talk later this afternoon, and that's going to be a bit more about kind of the political implications of this kind of history that I talk about. And I was trying to understand how I could divide the presentation this morning and this afternoon, that I wouldn't be kind of duplicating things, repeating things, because hopefully if many of you can join, that would be fantastic for the presentation after the service today. And I was trying to think about, okay, what can I talk about this morning that, you know, is still very important to discuss. And so I was looking up pictures of Palestine to try and include in some of these slides, and I would type in Palestine to Google, click on images, and roughly, you know, half of the images I'd find are of fighting, of, you know, people crying, of bombs going off, of Israeli raids. And it made me think about the fact that even my presentation today, a lot what I'm going to talk about is quite heavy, you know, political aspects of things. But I realized that, you know, what's really important to talk about is that Palestine is also just a place where everyday people live, has beautiful products, it has beautiful sites to go and visit. And so that's kind of what I wanted to talk about for the rest of the presentation, and then we'll also get into questions kind of at the end. But again, I kind of just wanted to emphasize this fact that, you know, Palestine, usually when it's talked about, it's, you know, under the topic of fighting, of war, of oppression, of suffering, all of this. But it's important to talk about that, you know, Palestine itself also has these beautiful places to go visit and all of this. Yeah.
Now, one reason I came was I'd like to hear your escape.
Okay. Cool. I'll definitely get into that at the end. I can definitely talk about that. So yeah, just very quickly on these quick slides. So, you know, I included a picture of olive farming here because that's traditionally a huge part of Palestinian culture. The olive tree itself kind of symbolizes Palestinian rootedness in their land. And yeah, it's very famous for its olives, its olive oil. It's, yeah, very, very fantastic. And the war started at the very, very beginning of the olive harvest season, which has been very difficult for farmers in the West Bank, especially because due to the proximity to settlements and stuff like this, and just violence if they leave their homes, a lot of the olives have not been able to been harvested, and the season has really failed, which is quite sad because it is very delicious. Then we have a bread called kak al-quds. That's my favorite bread from Jerusalem. And then we also have some food here, kind of traditional Palestinian foods, so hummus, falafel, maklube, all these items, very, very well-known Palestine for its agriculture and for its kind of products that come from the land. We also have here soap, which is very famous in the city of Nablus. And yeah, I wanted to touch on the fact that, you know, the reason that these pictures are here, and that's the food, it's the olives, all this, is because Palestine historically, because of where it is in the land, as John talked about today in the Bible verse, agriculture is a very important part of Palestinian history, not just because of the products itself, because we need food, but also because symbolically it's very important, because it signifies that, our food comes from the land, we come from the land, we work on the land, this land is ours historically, we are connected to it. And so for Palestinians, that's quite an important kind of point to make. And also I included here Taibeh beer, which is from a Christian town not too far from where I was living, that has a very, very nice, it's the only microbrew beer in all of the Middle East. Very, very nice, but also wanted to include it because it's going to the brewery and talking with them kind of brings up the good point about how difficult it is for Palestinian products to come from around the world, basically, or how to be exported around the world, because they were explaining kind of their process of how, they make their beer, they ship it out, and it's very emblematic, I guess, of the experience in Palestine in general. So in order to be able to get their beer in the West Bank, to then send it around the world, they have to have multiple truck drivers who have multiple different types of ID who are able to cross through the West Bank, exit the West Bank, bring it to Israeli ports that then have to be checked by different bureaucratic processes that can then be inspected at any time under the guise of kind of it being potentially aiding to terrorist organizations, something like this. And so they face a lot of difficulties in being able to get their products out, which is the same for really any Palestinian product. So getting Palestinian products out into the world and people being able to see it is quite a difficult experience, and again, very emblematic of kind of the reality in the West Bank today and in Gaza. And then I kind of wanted to go through some of the kind of notable cities when visiting Palestine. I know many of you have been to Israel and Palestine through different trips, and so I just kind of wanted to highlight some of the different places. All these pictures that I'm going to use now for this section are pictures that I was able to take and I've included in the slideshow, and just kind of talk about their importance, their beauty, and kind of also their relevantness to kind of the general political discussion that I'm kind of talking about. So obviously Jerusalem, which is also known as Al-Quds, so an important part to kind of mention, and I have this in several of the other slides. Many cities, again, throughout Palestine are traditionally Arab, Palestinian, but at the start of the State of Israel, a lot of the names were changed in a kind of way to give, to give Israelis kind of a justification for being there and kind of changing the name. So, it's now known as Jerusalem, but initially it's called Al-Quds. That's the kind of local historical name for it. But yeah, so important to mention, we have obviously the major religions here, all inside an old town, or an old quarter within Jerusalem. So we have here, which is the Western Wall, otherwise known as the Wailing Wall, which is located right next to here, which I'll talk about in a second. It's kind of on the wall of remains to a temple that King Solomon builds in the 10th century BC, that's later rebuilt by Herod the Great in 5th BC, and it's the most important site in the Jewish religion, and so it's an important place for them to be able to pray. And that is, again, right next to here, which is the Dome of the Rock, which is in the same compound as the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where the Prophet Muhammad ascends to heaven, and is the third most important site in all of Islam, and very important site in Jerusalem itself, one of the most recognizable aspects, obviously, in Palestine and in the region. And then we also have the Holy Church of the Sepulchre, which is where the site, basically, where it's understood that Jesus is crucified. And so, again, to kind of mention that there's these three major religions here, and that they, try to coexist all together. And it's really interesting to be able to be in the old city and to see kind of these religions and, their followers kind of all congregating in the same area, but obviously also what leads to a lot of the tension today. And then we have here, again, the different names. It's historically known as Akka here, but on maps you'll see it as Acre or Akko. I included here on the map. So I wanted to include this partially also because it's not in the West Bank, which you see here. It's not in Gaza, which is down here. It's right up here in this kind of green flag area right here. And again, I include this in a presentation about Palestine because, again, historically, all of this is Palestinian. And you have Palestinian remnants still today in many cities, which is probably one of the best seen in Akka itself. It's a very beautiful small port town, historically quite important because it's where a lot of the Crusades go through. There's a lot of remnants of that, including a tunnel that goes through the old city where Templar Knights used to use. And it's also where defenders push out Napoleon when he tries to take over the Middle East. So that's quite an interesting fact there. Very beautiful port city. Then we get to Nablus, which should have a video. There it is. One of the biggest cities in all the West Bank, probably my personal favorite. Also, again, to kind of mention the prominent religions, there's a very important mosque there. There's also a church, which is where Jacob's Well is, which is where in the New Testament Jesus meets the Samaritan woman. If many of you maybe know that story, is located here just outside of Nablus. Here, I'll play this video. No, I won't. Yeah, anyway. And it's also a city where there's a lot of kind of conflict, a lot of Israeli raids, which I try to highlight here is a mural on a wall. It says "Right to Resist," and here is a picture of some of the different martyrs that have been killed throughout the year inside the old city itself. These are basically everywhere throughout the city and kind of just highlights the fact that many kind of everyday civilians are killed as well as fighters themselves inside the city. And again, it's quite an emblematic dynamic of Palestine itself. As I really like this city, I tried to visit many times, but a lot of the time I couldn't go because I would look and I would see that there would have been an Israeli military raid on the city, and so it's not safe to go, or that on the way from where I lived, which is around an hour and a half drive from Nablus, there would be settlers attacking Palestinian cars on the road, and because I didn't have tons of money to necessarily go in a taxi or something like this, I would have been going in a kind of public transport Palestinian car, and that's susceptible to having rocks thrown at it, shooting at it, stuff like this. So again, it's kind of a emblematic, story about how it is to kind of travel in the West Bank. And then we have Hebron, also known as Al-Khalil. Here, it is the biggest city in the West Bank in terms of population. It's very known for its kind of trade. One of the most important products that it has is pottery and, all of that. Sorry. And so because of this also, it also has a very contentious history. Again, it's a very kind of microcosm of Palestine and the West Bank and how the occupation works, unfortunately. So we have here, which is Shuhada Street, which is now fully closed. It was one of the biggest parts of the Old Town Hebron market, which is also kind of pictured here, which is this beautiful market, but was shut down in 1994 after an American-Israeli settler massacres 29 Palestinian worshippers inside the Al-Ibrahimi Mosque, which I kind of have a picture of here in the early morning during their prayers. It also injures 160 other people, goes in with a gun and kills all these people during Ramadan. And after that period, Israeli authorities completely shut down the kind of old city area. And then when they reopen it, the mosque has been now divided into partial synagogue, partial mosque. This street is shut down because of security controls. All of the Palestinians here who own these shops are kicked out. They don't get any money as compensation. And today is kind of a deserted street and just a very, heavy kind of area to walk through. Now there's still this market here, but as you can see here, there's a fence kind of running along the top of the entire market because Hebron itself is a very unique city because there is a population of 200,000 Palestinians, and there's also 800 settlers that live within the city, and there's 2,000 Israeli military personnel there to protect the 800 settlers who live on top of the Palestinians in many areas and have been known to throw rocks down at the people walking in the market, throw acid, stuff like this. And so as kind of just a general protection, there is this fence kind of running along here. And again, Hebron is a very, very unique city because of this and because of the fact that you have settlers living on top of Palestinians within the city itself. But kind of some of the dynamics there are, again, kind of demonstrate the very heavy, constant fear and presence that the occupation has for many Palestinians. And then we have Bethlehem. Obviously, a lot of us know the city of Bethlehem. Very important, obviously, in the Christian faith. But again, to kind of highlight that, like most of Palestine, there is a very kind of smooth relationship between Christians and between Muslims here. We have a minaret right here of a mosque that's also right across the street from the Nativity Church, where it said that Jesus is born, and again, kind of shows the fact that Palestinians are not just purely Muslim, they're also Christian, and that, yeah, it's important to kind of consider that fact. It's just below, located just below Jerusalem, but it is inside, what is now known as the West Bank, so there is this kind of separation wall that you can visit that kind of goes all along the city and divides a lot of the city from kind of its historical neighborhoods and stuff like this. And there's also, for people who are into art or anything like that, there is the famous street artist Banksy, who has very many kind of works within the city, including this picture here of a Palestinian protester throwing a bouquet of flowers, which is quite interesting to be able to see. And then we get to kind of last slide before we get to questions, and then, yeah, so the Palestinian symbolism is quite important, because as I'll talk about in the presentation later today, kind of the biggest way of seeing this is that in 2004 there was a ban on Palestinian flags, or really any flag that Israeli authorities deemed to be supporting terrorism, which again is usually the Palestinian flag itself is considered that. So there's many kind of symbols that are now used to kind of represent Palestine, which we have here. We have the keffiyeh, which is also what I'm wearing today. It's kind of a popular traditional headdress used by farmers, used by herders and stuff like this, but becomes kind of a symbol of both Palestinian resistance itself as well as the Palestinian identity. What's kind of interesting with that is it has these different designs, if you can see here. So we have these kind of horizontal and vertical lines, which represent the trade routes which Palestine is famous for. We have here these kind of more wavy looking design, which is the olive tree leaves, and then we have, like right here, you can see a fishnet pattern, which symbolizes, the famous Palestinian fishing in Gaza and along the coast. So that's quite an interesting part as well. Then here we have a key. This is a picture I took in one of the refugee camps in Bethlehem, and the key is a very important kind of symbolic item in Palestine, because it represents the right to return for these 7 million refugees that live around the world, as well as in Palestine itself. Many people, when they fled during the Nakba, that period I talked about in 1948, a lot of people brought with them and still today have keys to their house, because they assumed, okay, I'm going to be going maybe for a week, a month, a year, then I'm going to be able to go back to my house. And so they bring their keys with them, and these keys are passed down by generation to generation by people who hope that their kids are going to be able to go back to their house. But obviously, many of these houses have been torn down or now are occupied by Israelis themselves. And so, especially in the refugee camps, you'll see a lot of pictures of keys and stuff, because it represents their desire to be able to get back to their homeland itself. Then here we have a kind of outline, a watermelon outlining historical Palestine. The watermelon is used a lot because, again, as I talked about, the Palestinian flag is often taken down, is deemed as being a symbol of terrorism in Palestine itself. And so a creative way that people have gotten around this is by bringing a watermelon to protests or displaying a watermelon, because it has very similar colors to the Palestinian flag, which is white, red, green, and black, which obviously you can see here as well as with the watermelon. And there's been a few very interesting cases of when watermelons are confiscated as being terrorism. That's quite a, obviously interesting dynamic. And then we have the Visit Palestine poster, which is a poster that was created in 1936 by a German Zionist, using it to kind of, again, advertise for people to go to Palestine, which is quite interesting and quite symbolic and kind of ironic, because now today, Palestine by Israelis, especially by those on the right, don't consider Palestine as being a place that's, maybe not on a map. There is no Palestine, but it's interesting to think that, back in 1936, it was used in this poster to kind of promote Jewish immigration, talking about going to this place of Palestine where you see the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque right here. And again, it's kind of just an interesting demonstration of how, there's this dynamic of, where is Palestine, does Palestine exist, all of that. Yeah, and this brings me basically to the end. I have this link here. I think we also have some papers that we'll put out but you can also try and scan here. I'll leave this up here. I made this document shortly after the war started in October to be able just to send to my family, where I have this is linked to a Google Doc that I created that has links to kind of if you want to learn more about Palestine. My biggest thing with wanting to have this presentation and agreeing to do this and just in general is that I think the minimum that we can all do ourselves is to educate ourselves. That's, I think, the very minimum. I don't expect everyone to be able to go to protest, to donate money, to be able to use their time in different ways, but I think at a minimum, all of us have the ability to educate ourselves and to learn more. And so I created this document just to send to my family, and if they wanted to pass around, and now I'm sharing it here, where I lay out a couple links to media websites that kind of talk more about what's happening now with the war, as well as Palestine in general, some social media links to both photojournalists that are covering the war in Gaza right now, as well as just kind of providing news, some books that I recommend reading that kind of inform you more about Palestine, as well as some movies, TV shows, YouTube videos, as well as a few places to donate if you are wanting to do that as well. So I encourage you to look at that. And I'll leave this up here so that people can scan it now or later. But yeah, if we can get some questions, I'd love to talk through that. Okay. Yeah, so for me leaving, it was a very weird process because the war started, and that day, the day that the war started, I was planning to go with some friends to go visit another city up in the north, and then we look at the news, we open our phones, it's like, okay, I guess we're not doing that today because the war starts when Hamas attacks Israeli cities and all of this, but in the West Bank as well, we knew that whenever something happens in Gaza, something also happens in the West Bank, because obviously both are Palestinian. And so we don't do that, but then we kind of just stayed, and I stayed for a couple days to kind of see what was going to happen, see where things were going to go, but quickly realized that it wasn't going to be safe to try and stay there. And so I think it was like on a Tuesday morning or something. It was like, okay, I'm probably not going to leave for another week. Then it was, okay, I think we're going to leave tomorrow. And then like about 10 o'clock at night, it was, okay, I'm going to leave at 5 in the morning tomorrow. And part of the problem about figuring out how to leave was that, again, you have these different areas within the West Bank itself that are dangerous, that are next to settlements, all of this. And there were many people who were attacked by settlers as they were just driving around the roads. I had a colleague who was coming back the day after the war from the weekend, and she was trying to come back to work. And her bus that she was on got attacked by settlers who threw rocks at it and destroyed part of the car. And so it was kind of figuring out how am I going to get out actually to the border, and ended up contacting someone from an organization that I'm now working with who gave me information to a taxi, but part of the problem was that I wanted to make sure that we had a taxi that, I'll talk about this in the presentation after the service today, but that had the proper license plate that could actually go through Israeli-controlled areas. Yeah, and anyway, finally it worked out. We got a taxi that managed to take us to the border with Jordan, which is not that far, but we had to go through all these different detours because the Israelis had closed different exits and entries into the city that I was living in. And so we had to drive through this other area and had to take a bunch of detours because there had been a lot of fighting in that area itself. And yeah, managed to get to the border safely. So it's not maybe necessarily the most crazy story, but I think also something that was quite interesting with this in general that makes me think about is that I was subscribed to the American Embassy in Tel Aviv, or in actually now Jerusalem, kind of giving security updates about how you can get out and stuff. And I was like, okay, maybe they're going to have some information about how they can help me get out. But again, what I think is quite important to consider, because the U.S. is one of the biggest allies of Israel, kind of also has this dynamic where all of the updates only talked about, okay, get to the airport in Tel Aviv as quick as you can, do this, but I couldn't do that because I was in the West Bank, which has checkpoints that if you want to leave the West Bank, you have to go through an Israeli military-controlled checkpoint, which were all shut. And so I wasn't able to get out through that way. I would have to go through the land border way, and I thought it was interesting that the U.S. Embassy itself didn't even really think about the fact that Americans or Palestinians who are also dual nationals as Palestinians would not be able to go out that way. And so, yeah, ended up having to go through Jordan, and that's where I am now today. So, yeah, hopefully that answers that. Yeah, please.
I'm interested to know what you were doing at your NGO. What was your role and what was your purpose there?
Yeah, so the one I was working at before in Palestine. Okay, yeah. So yeah, it was an agricultural organization. I was doing the, kind of specific part was grant writing, so I was applying for funding that we could then use to fund some of our projects. A lot of our projects are very technical, kind of agricultural type projects to support farmers in areas like Area C and kind of that are more vulnerable to violence and stuff like this. One of the biggest ones that I was working on was kind of a project I was designing as I left and was trying to get funding for, was for something called the Seed Bank. So they have the seed bank where they grow indigenous seeds that they research, cultivate, protect, that are purely from Palestine. They grow them and then they distribute them to farmers throughout that area who otherwise can't afford these types of seeds and that rely on less water, fertilizers, stuff like this, which is really important because Palestine is an area that's pretty heavily hit by climate change. And so they were doing a lot of these projects to kind of both promote Palestinian access to resources like water and to their own land, but then also kind of doing projects that support them in their resilience to things like climate change. Yeah. Any other questions? Please.
What's your feeling as to when and if you'll ever be able to go back?
I'll plug my ear.
Yeah. When I'll be able to get back? Yeah, I'm temporarily living in Jordan, working with this organization, but our head office was in Gaza, and we had a regional office that was in the West Bank, and yeah, the hope is that we're probably going to try and go back within the year, but it's quite difficult to understand, when that's going to be possible. We're obviously not going to go to Gaza. Our office has been completely bombed and destroyed. So it would be back to the West Bank. I'm maybe going to be visiting in January itself, going for a quick visit for a couple days to the West Bank to kind of visit some colleagues and kind of partners that we work with. But yeah, it's kind of hard to understand because the security situation is so fluid and difficult to kind of fully understand. But yeah, hopefully soon. / hopefully not for my mom soon.
Yeah, just say, he's only home for the 3 weeks for Christmas because he didn't know about the job that he was coming to Jordan. So he heads back to Jordan this week.
Yeah.
But to Jordan. So. You still have belongings and all on your flag that was
In Palestine? No, so that was again part of the debate about how am I going to leave and what am I going to do. I initially was going to leave some stuff there. I was like, I'll go back, it'll be fine. But in the end, was like, okay, no, I'm just going to take everything. So I brought everything with me in the taxi, and everything's with me now in Jordan. So nothing's back in Palestine at the moment, which, yeah.
Has the current company,
Organization, yeah.
organization, have they reestablished any kind of headquarters or offices in Jordan?
Yeah, we've temporarily opened an office. We had to register with the Jordanian government that we were working there, but we're completely only working on Palestine still. So we have an office now set up there, but it's only me and one other person working there now because we have 10 colleagues who are displaced in Gaza and who are not able to work or able to access the internet, stuff like this. And then we had one colleague in Ramallah, where I was living before, in Palestine, the West Bank. And then now there's only 2 of us in Jordan. So we're there, but only I think for 6 months or something, and then we have to decide if we want to go back to Palestine or if we want to renew our time in Jordan. But yeah, please.
Kyle, you're in London, you're doing your studies, you finish your studies. What drove you to this part of the world? I'm sure you had other things to look at.
Yeah.
Something about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I guess it was several things. I mean, part of it was that I was trying just to get experience and try to work kind of a little bit anywhere, but Palestine specifically kind of drew me for 2 reasons. One was that the university I was at had quite a few friends who were Palestinian. Actually, that's where I got this kafia. It was from one of my best friends is from Palestine, from Hebron, Khalil, one of the cities I talked about. And so I hadn't really known much about Palestine when I went to London in the beginning. It's something that Palestine's not really talked about that much, and just in school in general, and the news here in the U.S. And so I didn't really know too much about it. But then, after learning kind of what he had gone through and different experiences, I was already kind of aware of that, and kind of interested in working there. And I guess the second one, which is a bit more relevant to this, is just that in general, growing up with my faith and growing up here, and in general, we're kind of taught to defend the weak and support people who can't support themselves and all of this. And so Palestine was one of those where they are able to support themselves and all of this, and they are very strong. But I wanted to go somewhere where I felt my skills and what I'd learned and all that would actually be able to be put to a use and be able to help people. And I felt that, yeah, Palestine was somewhere where I was going to be able to have that experience. And I luckily got offered this role with this NGO, and yeah, it kind of worked out that way. So yeah.
Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for being here. I'm Kathy Gaiman. I'm Kyle's mom, and we really want to thank you for being here and for your interest in the situation, because a lot of this started in our Christian Education Commission meeting, and I was saying it's hard because you feel like the work that he's doing, I feel like as a mom, of course, I'm proud of it, but it's important work and an important voice, and especially in the context of the things that we say here as far as our mission here at Hope. And so the idea behind this talk was to share some of his experiences, on the one hand, because a lot of you knew him as a little guy when he was here all these years, but also the idea for understanding that context of the current political situation. And so he was raised here in Cedar Park and went to Leander High School, then went to school in London to study development, and this development studies led him to choosing his first job he was working in Ramallah, and then when the war started, he had to leave, and a lot of you knew bits and pieces of that story of him leaving through my Facebook post, and the relief of him getting out. But he continues to work there. He's just home for the 3 weeks for Christmas, and leaves on Tuesday to head back to Jordan to continue the work that he's doing with NPA. So he'll talk a little bit about that, and then explain some of the things, and then he has time at the end for questions, if you have them. So this is my Kyle.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for coming, and thank you so much to Pastor Josh and everyone else at Hope for giving me this opportunity to talk about this. This is very, very cool, and yeah, very exciting to be back at a place where I kind of grew up and being able to talk about my current work, not because I'm necessarily proud of it or that I need to be speaking about my work, but because I think this is something that's very important to talk about and something that is not necessarily talked about in these spaces at all, if enough. And so I'm very happy to be able to share this with you. And I really appreciate all of you for coming, especially those of you who came this morning. I did have a bit of a talk this morning. I'm going to kind of go over a few small bits and pieces that I did in that one during this presentation as well, but a lot of it is going to be new information, so hopefully that's quite helpful to hear. I wanted to start off with saying that I have two main, goals from these presentations, both this morning and today. One of them is to give a bit of a voice to what's happening in Palestine and to Palestinian voices themselves, which obviously I am not. Obviously grew up here, everything, but oftentimes Palestinian experience, history, and voices themselves are left out, if not dismissed and silenced. And so for me, the most important thing is to be able to kind of give a bit of a platform to these voices and to what's happening there, because oftentimes these are ignored. And my second point is kind of that Pastor Josh really, I think, talked about it very well in his sermon today, that, our faith as Christians compels us to defend the weak. It compels us to do what we feel is just and right, and to help our neighbor, to hold hands with them. And I think it's important to be able to think about that in this context, and also because I think the minimum that we can do as human beings, as humanitarians, as Christians, is to educate ourselves. Not everyone is in the place to spend hours volunteering. Not everyone has the opportunity, like I've had, to be able to be there. Not everyone has the finances to be able to donate large sums of money that make a difference, but I think at a minimum what we can all push ourselves to do is to educate ourselves and to be aware and to open our minds to what's happening, and at least kind of provoking a thought and provoking us to kind of have those discussions with ourselves, with our neighbors, with our families, and all of this. And so those are my kind of 2 big points that I kind of want to touch on with the presentation today. Hopefully you get out of that. And as my mom said at the end, I will have some kind of question time at the end, because I do want to be able to have a bit of a discussion and to be able to talk about anything I've talked about or anything you've come in with questions today. So there will be an opportunity for that at the end. So yeah, my mom already gave a bit of my background, but yeah, grew up here obviously in Cedar Park, here at Hope, a lot of familiar faces since I was young. But after I graduated from Leander High School, I went to the School of Oriental African Studies in London, where I studied international development, which is basically kind of humanitarian work through the context of NGOs and stuff like this. And afterwards, I was lucky enough to get an internship with a local Palestinian organization called the Union of Agricultural Work Committees, UAC, right here. Here's the symbol right here, where I started last February, so about 11 months ago. And I was working with them, and they are a small organization that kind of works to support farmers, herders, fisher people, both in the West Bank and Gaza, with access to their resources, both land, water, the right to these resources, and also kind of with technical projects that support their resilience to climate change and other impacts such as this. And then I was working there for about 8 months in October until I had to leave about a week into the present war. I was in Ramallah in the West Bank at the time, and I unfortunately had to leave, and I was not able to continue with my job with this organization, but luckily was able to get a job with Norwegian People's Aid, a Norwegian-based NGO that works in about 30 different countries, including Palestine. And so I'm currently in Amman, Jordan, but only temporarily, but working fully on their Palestine country program. And without further ado, well, actually, yes, I have a quick map just because I think it's important to kind of to understand the map of Palestine, and that can be sometimes quite a contentious and confusing thing just to talk about in itself. Where is Palestine? What does it look like? But present day, here's just a screenshot I took from Google Maps. I was living right here in Ramallah in the West Bank. And as you can see, here's the Gaza Strip. So these are the 2 kind of occupied Palestinian territories that we kind of come to understand as Palestine today. It's about 50 miles from Ramallah to the Gaza Strip, which is approximately like from here at Hope to San Marcos. So, you know, not too close, but at the same time, again, I'll talk about in the next slide with some maps about kind of what Palestine looks like and kind of how the map has changed with the political history. I did this morning talk a lot about kind of the, let's say, a little bit more detailed history of Palestine that's important to understand kind of present day dynamics. And I'm going to try and touch on that a little bit, but I'm really not going to go too deep into it. So if there are specific questions that come up about that, I'll be happy to answer that. But at the same time, I encourage you, I'm going to have a bit of a slide at the end that kind of encourages you to do kind of your own reading and your own learning about Palestine and Palestinian history. So I'm just going to quickly touch on that, some of the important bits, but just to mention that. So I'm going to kind of use these maps as a bit of a way to talk about the history, because as I've already mentioned several times, the maps of Palestine have changed a lot alongside the political developments in the area. So traditionally, Palestine is this area here. We see here, it was under control of many different empires, dynasties, and the most recent was the Ottoman Empire. But after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, all of the Ottoman Empire's colonial areas get divided up between the powers that win in World War I, and Palestine becomes under control of the British Mandate under the British government. And this is what Palestine looks like before. So when you talk to Palestinians, when they think about Palestine, Palestine is this whole area, not necessarily the map I showed you earlier of the West Bank and Gaza. So everyone here, there's Palestinians scattered throughout here. And that's an important kind of consideration to think about at the beginning. So under the Ottomans, there's already a bit of a Palestinian national identity. There's already kind of nationalist movements happening at that time. So it's important to understand that even though there are all these different, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Assyrians, the Ottomans, there still is already a Palestinian identity, a Palestinian national consciousness that is there, that is suppressed largely, as will happen throughout history, but just to highlight that there is, even though there is this complex history and there's never been the Palestinian Empire, there already is a Palestinian kind of identity shaped and formed at that time. But then we get to the British Mandate period. The British try to kind of balance between the rise of Jewish immigration, and largely this happens under the political movement and concept of Zionism, which it founded in 1897 by Theodor Herzl. And it's this idea that there should be a Jewish national homeland in this area known as Palestine. So it's a lot of mainly European Jewish immigrants who come to Palestine under this movement, which I'm going to talk a bit more about in future slides. But the British Mandate really struggle with trying to control these two movements, so it would be one of Palestinians who have been living here in this area for centuries, and then recent Jewish immigrants fleeing things like the Holocaust and other forms of persecution. And what ends up happening is that a year before the British colonial period ends, the United Nations passes a partition plan in 1947 that is going to divide the state of Palestine, or the area of Palestine, into two separate regions. So we have the blue, which will be under Israeli control, and we have the green, which will be under Palestinian control. And then this yellow bit right here is Jerusalem, which is going to be internationally administered. So this is kind of the framework that is agreed upon, that is having the idea of having peace in the region, which there hasn't been for a long, long time. And this will be a way that kind of separates both Palestinian and Jewish, considered Israeli immigrants. It's largely quite an unpopular plan, mainly on both sides. Jewish immigrants, Israelis, under the kind of political movement of Zionism, feel that this entire area belongs to them. It has religious ties, that this should be their land, so they're upset that there's all these green areas. And Palestinians themselves are upset that there's all these blue areas, because at the time of the partition plan, 56% of the land, you can see here, is blue, which is going to be under Israeli control. However, at the time of the partition plan being drawn up in 1947, we have only 33% of the population in this entire area is Israeli, is Jewish, and only 7% of it, as you can see here with these kind of blue areas, is Israeli controlled. So it's taking a lot of land that is owned by Palestinians, has been for centuries, is giving them to Israelis as a way to create peace and hope for this, but it is already largely unpopular kind of already at this time. And then we have 2 years later, so in between 1947 and 1949, in between this kind of period is known as the Nakba, which in Arabic means catastrophe, and it's referred to this time when Israeli militias began attacking Palestinian communities in these kind of green areas as well as the blue areas to try and force them out of their homes and to be able to take over more of their land. And in this time, 750,000 to 1 million Palestinians are forced to leave their homes. Some of them resettle within these areas. Some of them settle outside the borders in neighboring Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt. And, yeah, please.
What was the population in 1947 of Arabs versus Jews?
That I cannot remember exactly. I know the divide was that there was 33% Israeli and there was 67% Palestinian. But going back, I think on the slide or presentation this morning, I showed there was a census in the Ottoman Empire in 1878 that I think it was 85.5% of Palestine at that time was Muslim, and there was probably, I think, 9.2% Christian, and I think a total of about 5% Jewish. So there's a huge Jewish immigration in that time to, again, escape the Holocaust, but also to be able to set up this Jewish homeland under the Zionist movement within Palestine. So I'm not sure of the exact number. So during the Nakba, a lot of people are forced to leave their homes. There's a lot of massacres carried out by these Israeli kind of paramilitary groups. In 1948, in between kind of this time here, the British leave. Their kind of period of control ends. They leave hours after the State of Israel is formally declared and formed. But the fighting keeps happening, and now after the State of Israel is declared, there starts to be a year of fighting between the Israeli military and the neighboring armies of, of Syria, of Jordan, of Egypt. And in 1949, they agreed to these armistice lines that leads to these areas here. We have the Gaza Strip right here and the West Bank right here. Both Palestinian, both, many of the same people, many of the people now residing in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1949 as well as today come from areas that are now considered part of the state of Israel. But these are the kind of agreed truce lines and is what makes up present day kind of West Bank and Gaza Strip. Then there's no map showing it, but in 1967 there's a 6-day war that was is quite important for what we're going to talk about, and it's because in this time the Israeli military attacks simultaneously against Egypt, against Jordan, against Syria, and they take, can't see it here, but there's the occupied Golan Heights that is currently under Israeli control up here. They take part of the Sinai Peninsula, which later goes back to Egypt. And then importantly, for talking about Palestine, they invade and then occupy all of the Gaza Strip and all of the West Bank here. So when I speak about the Israeli occupation, or you hear people talking about the Israeli occupation, it starts in 1967 formally, because this is when the Israeli military goes into these areas that, initially this was supposed to be, under the UN, these are supposed to be Palestinian areas. It gets cut down to this after the fighting, and then all of this gets overrun and is now all formally under Israeli occupational control. And then we skip forward quite a long time from 1967. We go through the Oslo Accords, which I'm not really going to get into the specifics. I'm going to get into some of the kind of consequences of the Oslo Accords that happened in the early 90s. But after the Oslo Accords and then now today, this is kind of, if we look at where Palestinians are, what Palestinian-controlled areas are, it's here. So we still have the Gaza Strip, which is now under full blockade and has been since 2006. And then we have the West Bank here, which after the Oslo Accords and the redefining of the territory to area A, B, and C, which I'll touch on in a bit and can be a bit confusing, but it's still important to talk about, we get areas within the West Bank that are under Palestinian control, and we get 60% of the West Bank, which is now under Israeli control. So, yeah. So the Golan Heights is an area up here that is Syrian territory that in the 1967 war is now occupied, and it's deemed an illegal occupation under the UN, under the war that's not recognized as part of Israel, but they currently occupy, and it's just across from the Sea of Galilee. So yeah, that's just to touch on some bits of history. I've not really covered a lot of it, but I want to kind of touch on those things, just trying to be very quick on understanding that, because it is important for understanding today. So yes, today. Today in Palestine is considered an apartheid system according to Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and many other internationally recognized human rights organizations. Many of us know apartheid as being associated with South Africa, where black South Africans did not have equal or even sometimes basic human rights compared to white South Africans, and this is largely the same in Palestine, which again is, as we talk about today, is both the West Bank and Gaza. Aspects of this apartheid-like system is settlements, which are found in the West Bank, where Israeli, usually far-right settlers live, and I'll have a slide that talks specifically about settlements, so we can talk a bit more about that. In the West Bank, and have larger access to resources and infrastructure and services compared to Palestinians. We have areas A, B, and C, which I've talked about here. Area A is under full Palestinian control. This is designated under those Oslo Accords that happened in the 90s. It's agreed that Palestinians in these areas are under Palestinian control. It's mainly in the larger cities like Bethlehem, Ramallah, Jenin, Qalqilia, areas like this. We have Area B that is under joint Israeli-Palestinian control, and Area C, which is about 60% of the West Bank here in blue, where Palestinians live under military martial law in these areas, while Israeli settlers who largely live in Area C in the West Bank are under civilian law. So that's an important consideration there. Then we have the apartheid/security wall that you can see here that runs along most of the West Bank, either through this kind of formal wall-like structure or through fencing and just different aspects of this, but basically is built in the early 2000s and cordons off most of the Palestinians in the West Bank from being able to freely move. And then we have the Gazan blockade, which is obviously a very important aspect as well, where in 2006, a similar security type wall is created around the Gaza Strip, an area that has 2 million Palestinians, and they have no access to leaving. They have no control of their borders of the Gaza Strip itself. They don't have access to a lot of basic services like water, electricity, fuel, all of these things. And then, so today we have about 7.2 million Palestinian refugees globally. Largely, this can be found in kind of surrounding areas, Lebanon, in Syria, a lot in Jordan, a few in Egypt. But this also includes Palestinian refugees in current-day West Bank and Gaza itself. And that's can be kind of a confusing, I guess, way of explaining it, because they're in Palestine. How are they considered refugees? And it's because many of them in 1948 or after that have had to flee areas where they lived. They've had to leave their homes very quickly out of fear of being killed, and they go to different areas where they're not from. So a refugee might be someone who was living on the coast in what is called now present-day Tel Aviv. They flee to, let's say, Ramallah, which is where I was living, and they go there, and they're now living in refugee camps. And there's still many, many refugee camps today within both the West Bank and Gaza. And under the UN, they're recognized as internationally kind of registered refugees with access to the same laws, including the right to return, which I'll get to in a bit. But yeah, so today, I don't know if, I can go back to the previous slide. We have 3 million Palestinians living in the West Bank, 2 million living in Gaza itself, and 2 million living scattered throughout present-day Israel, in addition to the 7.2 million who live around the world, as well as in Palestine itself. So this is, I thought, a quite useful way of understanding the size of present-day occupied Palestinian territories. Put on Austin, so you see here, this is Gaza here. And you can see, it goes from Pflugerville to just before Buda. It's very small, and that's in its longest form, but we also have from, I don't know my roads very well anymore because I haven't lived here in a while, so I can't tell you which roads it's in between very much. But obviously a very small area for 2 million, over 2 million people to be living in today, especially when they're being indiscriminately bombed and told to go to safe places when there is no safe places when you have an area this small, crammed full of people. So yeah, just important to kind of mention that to understand the scale of that. And this brings me very quickly, I'm just going to try and run through as best I can quite quickly kind of the current war, because this is the most, obviously, recent thing about Palestine being in the news. And it starts on October 7th with Hamas attacking with rockets and raids on. So I quickly have here, there's also, I think, some papers that might be around up here on the front. And I'll also leave it up here in case you want to come up afterwards, because maybe it doesn't work from farther back, a QR code to a document I made shortly after I went to Jordan that I just sent to my family. Yeah, one second, then I'll get to questions, yeah. That has, I just made a document that has a couple links, it's like 2 pages long, that has links to media outlets that I think very accurately cover what's happening now with the war in Palestine as well as Palestine in general. So it has some links to those. It has links to some social media web pages, whether it's news programs on social media or Palestinians themselves or like photojournalists in Gaza taking pictures of what's happening and posting it on social media. There's also links to some books, and then also links to some movies, TV shows, YouTube clips that are easily accessible that kind of help learn more about Palestine if you have the urge to do so, which I really encourage you, because as I said at the beginning, I think the biggest thing is committing yourself to learn and to be open to learning, even if you come at it from a different perspective. Ignoring it is not the way to do things, and ignoring problems and ignoring people that have been there is part of what's gotten us to today. So I really encourage you to take time to learn more through any of these means, any of these types of means, any other ones I haven't included, to learn more about Palestine and to be able to share that and to be able to discuss that with people. Because I think talking with Palestinians, that's the biggest thing that anyone asks, and that's why I think they're so friendly when you come and visit, is because they're just so happy you're there, and they say, please just talk about us. Like, please tell people about what's happening here, what you've seen, because that's not necessarily happening, and that's quite an easy way to do things and something that we can all do. So I really encourage you to use this to maybe learn more about it, and that's it. So any questions that we can maybe quickly talk about if we have a bit of time? Please, sir.
Yeah, Kyle, you are obviously a
So the first part is, I guess, no. Like when I crossed to Jerusalem, I showed that picture of a checkpoint that I had taken. I have to cross through. I can go through if I'm on the bus. There's also a bus that can go through. If I'm on that bus, I can stay in my seat. I have to show my passport when the guy with the big machine gun comes through and looks at all of our IDs. But if I'm Palestinian, I have to get off, go into a separate line, be questioned, go through kind of security body checks, and then I can get out on the other side and then meet up with the bus and then go. So I'm very privileged with that. I'm also, for example, crossing through the airport. I have to delete for my own kind of security, safety, and being able to go where I want to go. I have to delete things on social media that mention Palestine. I'm not going to bring this, much less wear it, stuff like this. But I am able to get in because I have an American passport. And they see that and they go, okay, yep, you're good to go. Versus other people who might have a Arab-sounding last name, maybe have never been there, not from Palestine, but they're not going to maybe have the same ease as me. And in general, I mean, I guess I haven't had any major issues at this point, but there is kind of an issue, especially depending on organizations I work with or something. There could be all of a sudden a question of, what are you doing? You're supporting terrorist groups, because there are NGOs that are deemed as a terrorist organization because of the work they do, and if I'm in contact with them, that causes problems. So it's a bit of an issue with that. But what I will finish on quickly with that is that Palestinians I've never had an issue with in terms of my passport, and I remember being very worried, and the second I got off the bus, the first day I got there, I got out, was very clearly a tourist, didn't know what I was doing, and some old man walked past me, he was like, you're CIA, you're American CIA, and I was like, oh, come on, is that obvious? What am I doing? But since then, and including then, I've never had an issue. I mean, people are very understanding of the fact that, American government doesn't speak for me, I don't necessarily speak for it, and all of this, and so there is a very good understanding of that.
You had an Arabic name.
Yes, 100%. If I have an Arabic name, yeah.
And when they've asked, do you speak Arabic? Or when I was going, they say, do you know anybody that's Arabic? Like, a teacher, I know a lot of people. How do you define that? And so that's the basis question.
Yeah, so when you're leaving the airport or something, they'll ask you, where have you been? If you mention that you were anywhere in Palestine, you're going to be pulled into a separate line. I have to go through a separate line whenever I go through security, partly because they see I'm a young person traveling by myself, so I might be, working in Palestine or something like that, aware of Palestine, and so I go into a separate security line of many other people whenever I had to go through the airport, and in that line is also many Arabs and all of this. So it's very, they don't really hide the fact that it's quite discriminatory, I guess is a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Is there any distinction between Christian Palestinians and Muslim Palestinians? Are they treated differently?
No, it's the same. If you're Christian, you're still subject to the same checkpoints. I mean, maybe, I don't know this at all for sure, but maybe, if you're being interrogated, maybe that's gonna, help you out. But you're treated the same way. You have the same IDs, you have the same everything, and Christian Palestinians go through, horrible stuff and are, even in Gaza and the West Bank. So, yeah.
I apologize if you spoke to this in one of your earlier talks, but why are the checkpoints there in the first place, and what is your experience and the Palestinians' experience with getting to the Arab countries surrounding it?
Yeah. I mean, the reason that they're there is, again, kind of in this broad, general, I mean, it's meant to be broad way of security, and stopping terrorism and Israelis, being secure. And even though you're in the West Bank and, you're in an area that's supposed to be Palestinian, that is Palestinian. And so it's kind of under the guise of this, but if you ask me, it's partly for the reason that, again, it's this kind of daily wearing down Palestinians and wearing them down.
It might be because of the daily rockets, snipers, and suicide bombers trying to get into Israel.
I would say no, personally. I think, huh? Yeah, I mean, I would say that's the case, but I would say if there's that, then there also needs to be Palestinian checkpoints against Israelis who come and kill many Palestinians, because I think that's the biggest thing, is that there's violence on both sides, and one of them is done by a state, one of them is done by individuals who are, partly because they're individuals, are terrorists, and so I think that it has stopped that to an extent. If you look after the second Intifada and when the wall goes up, the wall stops some attacks from happening, but it also stops everyday people from enjoying their basic rights. So I think everything has to be looked at, I guess, in a way beyond maybe, okay, what it's presented as, and also kind of what it does for people who, aren't people who are participating in armed fighting. So I hope that kind of answers the question a bit. Traveling between them? I mean, for me, I don't have any issue other than the fact, again, that American passport means that I couldn't go to Yemen now, I can't go to Iran, stuff like this, obviously. But in general, for Palestinians, they're welcomed everywhere very strongly, and it's actually interesting listening to friends talk about they go to Tunisia, and they're just like taken care of from the moment they get in. People are inviting them to their homes and going, "You're Palestinian, like, yes, we want you here, we want to take care of you," because many Arab countries, the reason it's a bit of a regional conflict is because there's kind of, for similarity in culture, language, stuff like this, an appreciation for the plight of Palestinians, and kind of, taking this into recognition. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, so I mean, what's happening, and let me try to go back quickly to the slide that has the map of it. I mean, that's probably the best one. Yeah, so I mean, here, this is the sea all along here, and then from here all the way down to this corner is Israeli, and then this is the border crossing with Egypt. And the 2 million Palestinians here, largely civilians that are trying to avoid being killed in all this, both are not allowed to go into Egypt. They're not allowed at all to go into Israel, and that's never really been brought up as even a possibility. And the Egyptians don't want them, a lot of it for selfish reasons, a lot of it being we don't want to have the responsibility of taking care of all these Palestinians on the Sinai Peninsula. All of this, it's going to create dynamics at home, elections, stuff like this. But it's also because, and I think it's really interesting and important to understand, is that a lot of Gazans don't want to go into Egypt. A lot of Gazans don't want to leave because they've been treated to having to move from their homes. Many of them are refugees. A huge percentage of people in Gaza are refugees from 1948, 1967, all these times, and they don't want to leave because they know, or maybe not know, but they feel that if they leave their homes, if they go to Egypt, they're not going to be let back in, and they're not going to be able to go back to their homes because that's happened to them before. And so it's a mix. I think Egypt, for example, uses this sentiment to their advantage to be self-serving and to not allow people in, but it's also because Palestinians themselves don't want to leave their land because they're worried about what happens if they do. So, yeah. Please. All right. My talk is now ending, and I will be... what do I think is the solution? I mean... Yeah. 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 Thank you. I try. But, I mean, I guess the biggest thing is that I think, and like this is obviously a very easy thing to say, hard to actually do, but I think sounds so stupid even just saying it, the violence has to stop. Like, there has to be an understanding that, this doesn't mean you can do this. Just because Hamas goes and kills 1,200 Israelis doesn't mean Israel can kill 22,000 Palestinians. Because that's not even like balanced if you look at it, but also, there can't be this dynamic of, okay, for example, whenever there is an Israeli raid in a refugee camp in the West Bank, Palestinians are killed, immediately, basically, like, okay, I'm going to stay off the roads because I think Palestinians are going to kill settlers. And so it's this constant back and forth of like, this means I get to do this to you. And it's been going on for more than a century. And so that's the biggest thing. But how do we get to that point? I don't know. I guess the biggest way, for example, for me, the way I feel, what's my role, what can I actually do? Because you feel so helpless when you think about this, talking about the violence needs to end. How do you actually get to that point? How does any of us actually create that? And I think it has to be partly from international pressure, because I think international pressure, again, our government's doing it or us doing it on their behalf is the main thing that's going to stop, for example, in the West Bank, you know, Israeli apartheid-like system there. And I think hopefully that stopping, there not being checkpoints, there not being daily humiliation, stops radicalizing people and at least helps stop the violence. Like there's so many dynamics and levels to it, and it's just, yeah, mind-numbing. But like, I think there has to be, you know, a line drawn at some point of this can't keep happening, because what's happening in Gaza and, you know, the constant bombardment, that's not going to stop. Even if every single Hamas person is going to be killed, there's going to be a new Hamas created, because how many people have had their family members killed or been sniped when they've been walking down the street or have been tortured? And like, that's not going to be the solution ever. And I think stopping that is what has to happen. And I think at this point, you know, us giving our voice is what's going to kind of help do that. But yeah, maybe, but you know, we don't know, and we can't know until we at least try and get closer to that. And yeah, I mean, I think, again, I don't even know with like a two-state solution is that going to work. I don't know. Many Palestinians say that, and Israelis say we want that because at least like it's going to stop things. But you have settlements there. What's going to happen to the checkpoints? What's going to happen to water? Stuff like this. It's like how are you going to get to that kind of point of it stopping? So yeah, hard one. Please. Yeah, I mean, so right now yeah, basically like what across this political spectrum, what is the sentiment by Israeli politicians on settlements, and those who don't support it, what do they see as potentially a solution for dealing with settlements? Right now, there's the most right-wing kind of coalition of parties in control of the Israeli government. They're very, very, very much in favor of settlements. I mean, they got democratically elected in, so there is quite high public Israeli support for the settlements and by the politicians they elect. But I would say it's pretty, I would think, more or less split down the middle. It's not, you know, not every Israeli wants settlements there and knows that it impedes the peace process. But what to do about it and the solutions that they've offered, I haven't seen that myself, and I don't know. I mean, there's been efforts in the past to close down some of the settlements and stop them, but those, you know, far-right people say, okay, well, then I'm not going to vote for you, and then, as we know, that can change minds pretty quickly when you don't get votes. And so, yeah, I'm not really sure what, you know, could be or what is being proposed as kind of the solution, other than them not being there. But how do you tell 700,000 people who desperately feel they belong there and maybe have been living there for 50 years, no, you can't be there anymore? So, yeah, it's a very, very difficult situation. Cool.
Just curious, have you met Israeli youth who are friends with the Palestinians, and they're like, you know, maybe college, you know, y'all's age, like talking with each other and having positive relationships with each other and open communication? Have you seen that?
Not much, and I mean that is part of the issue. I mean, again, just like there's not every Palestinian supports Hamas, not every Israeli supports Netanyahu and supports kind of extreme settlers and stuff like this. So there is a movement of people, you know, saying we're not going to go into the draft to fight. We're not going to go into the Israeli Defense Forces because we don't believe what they're doing is morally right. So there is people like this, especially young people. The biggest issue, I would say, in terms of people being able to talk and have these discussions, I mean, we live in an age where talking and discussions don't really necessarily happen between differing viewpoints. And again, that's an important thing, I think, with having this, whether it's between us or between family or whatever, we have to be able to talk about this, even though it's a difficult topic. But one of the issues in terms of Israelis and Palestinians talking is that Palestinians can't go into Israel. The Palestinian youth can't go into Israel, and many Israeli youth, whenever you enter in Area A of the West Bank, which is full Palestinian control, it has a big red sign in English, Arabic, and Hebrew saying Israeli citizens cannot enter this area. It's dangerous for your lives, and you'll be prosecuted. You can't enter. So there's barely even ways for people to get in contact. So that kind of also just impedes it kind of structurally already. But Yeah. So yeah, that was last question. I'm happy to stand outside and talk with you if anyone wants to talk a bit more about this. Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you again, Pastor Josh and Hope, for allowing me to come talk. I really appreciate it. Very cool thing that you guys are doing. And yeah, thank you all for coming. Have a great day. Thank you.